souls, so long that I would have not thought death had undone so many. This translation that T.S. Eliot will use in Wasteland Marketed 3a. We're going to see this line, and when we see this line, we're going to remember that it comes back here to Canto 3, okay? I had not thought death had undone so many. In other words, this is Dante's brilliant way of saying, in the underworld, I couldn't believe how many people had lived and died. I mean, think about it. By 1300, we're obviously talking about a really, really long time that people have been alive on the planet and have died. And where did so many of them go? Well, they went here, which is not technically hell, but it certainly is not heaven. And where do they? Well, they go in a circle, just swirling in a circle, right? When more than one I recognized had passed. So in other words, now here we go. This is our first recognition moment. Let's say this in our notes. We have these recognition scenes. Remember in the Odyssey when we had recognition scenes when people want to know, who are you? And Dante or Odysseus will let people know finally who he is. And of course the most famous with Telemachus, with Penelope, with Laertes' father. Here we're going to have our first recognition scene where Dante's going to go, hey, I recognize that person. Now, this will be Dante the poet's ability to put all kinds of interesting people in hell. And he'll do this in really fascinating ways, and here's our first example of it. He says, I recognized a shade, I beheld a shade, of him who made the great refusal, impelled by cowardice. Now, that's all Dante says about it. Scholars have usually said that this is probably a pope, believe it or not, Pope Callistin V. Now, there's an interesting story about Pope Callistin V. There was this friend of his in 1294. Callistin V had been for 5 months Pope. And there was a pal of his who kept whispering in his ear, I don't think if being a Pope is what you're called to do, because you might lose your soul through all of this. You probably should just abdicate your papal office and go off and live a quiet monk's life. And in fact, Callistin decided to do this very thing, and he hands over then the opportunity of being the Pope to Boniface VIII. And as you know from our introductory comments, if there's any Pope that Dante feels is responsible for the end of Italy and the end of the Catholic Church, it's Boniface VIII. And in fact, we'll have references here in Canto 19 and 27 to Boniface VIII again. So the great refusal implied by cowardice. So at once I understood, beyond all doubt, that this was the dreary guild, repellent both to God and his enemies, hapless ones, never alive, their bare skin galled by wasps and flies, blood trickling down the face, mingling with tears for harvest underfoot by writhing maggots. So get the word picture here. And again, this contrapessio, we're going to see this a lot, where, okay, in life they never could make up their mind. So what are they? They're stung by these nasty wasps and flies, so much so that their blood's going down their face. It drips down onto the ground, and then their blood is being eaten by the maggots over and over again. It is a grotesque image. I warned you already, we're going to see some of these. I've had students that say in a close reading of Inferno, they do have nightmares at night. So let me just warn you in advance. If you take these images seriously, and of course, many of these images find their way into all kinds of works of art and of course, movies as well. The torture scenes that we are going to see are deeply, deeply unsettling. And yet notice there's a point that's being made allegorically here. In other words, these people who can never figure out, what do I do, what do I do? So I'll do nothing. In their afterlife, they are forced to move by being stung, and the maggots will drink their blood. Disgusting. Then, to continue, when I turned my eyes further along our course, I could make out people upon the shore of some great river. Now, let's just point out the way in which Dante plays the game. He will play a game where we're on this kind of journey going from point A to point B to point C. I mentioned Pilgrim's Progress as a classic exemplar of this as well. I could mention Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, for those of you who have read that classic novel. It again is very violent, has a whole lot of Dante element and Dante-esque elements in it, along with Kafka-esque elements as well. And that idea that we're moving down onto the next one, onto the next. So we're going through these stages, if you will. It's a very linear way to read Dante, the poet, creating what it is he's doing. So we're done now with the uncommitted, and now we move on to the river. And we're going to find the first of 4 rivers in hell, Acheron here, okay, the great river. Master, I said, it seems by this dim light, line 60, that all these are eager to cross over. So he's lots and lots of people. Can you tell me by what law and who they are. Now, this mention of law is significant because you'll remember this is what Anchises said to Aeneas in the Aeneid, in Book 6 of the Aeneid, in the underworld. The thing that will make Romans Romans, the thing that will make it most significant is the idea of law. Then we go back to the last canto and remember that Dante's going to make the argument that Aeneas doesn't just provide us with the great people of Rome, but with the ability for St. Peter to become the first vicar, pope of the church, and thereby Christianity can gain its power as well. Notice here the word law. By what law, he asks, and who are they? He answered. Now Virgil will answer. Those are things you will discover when you have paused at Acheron's dismal shore. In other words, don't try to understand stuff too quickly. And we're told, I walked on with my head down after that, fearful I had displeased him and spoke no more. Now, two observations here. This will not be the last time that Virgil will come back with a harsh answer, the way sometimes teachers will sometimes come back with a harsh answer. I really need to know this. Yeah, I agree with that. No. I need you to tell me right now. Yeah, right. I agree with that too. Do you remember? We mentioned it already. Passage 46 of Song of Myself, Walt Whitman. I hear you, the questions you asking me. You must find out for yourself. There are some questions which don't have adequate answers that can be given by an instructor or a teacher or a guide. You have to find out for yourself. That's what Whitman's teacher says in passage 46, 47 of Song of Myself. And here we got the same thing going on. In other words, this will not be the last time that he feels, as student, Dante, the poet, the pilgrim, feels like he's maybe kind of screwed up a little bit, right? On we go. The other obvious observation is it takes time sometimes. I mean, we want to get to the answers quickly, right? Which is why sometimes we just want to read Cliff's Notes or Spark Notes or whatever for these classic texts. Read by deputy is what Bacon has called it, right? But there's moments when you got to go through it, all the way through it. Right? Bacon will say in Of Studies, some books you got to chew all the way up and digest. I hope this will maybe be one of those books for you. Then, at the river, an old man in a boat. We will, of course, know this old man from Book 6 of the Aeneid. This is Charon, right? The old man who ferries the souls across. White-haired, as he drew closer, shouting at us, "Woe to you, wicked souls! Give up the thought of heaven. I come to ferry you across into eternal dark on the opposite side, into fire and ice." We think about frosts. Some say the world will end in fire, sun, and ice. "And you there, leave this place." He's speaking now to Dante, the pilgrim. "You living soul, stand clear of these who are dead." And then, when he saw that I did not obey, note the irony, because this is going to be a poem about obedience, and yet we're told Dante the pilgrim won't obey. He just continues to stand there, right? "By other ports in a lighter boat," he said, "you will be brought to shore by another way." Some have suggested that there is another way, maybe the river Tiber, for example, where souls that are going to purgatory and on to heaven will find their way as opposed to, this. But now we got Virgil speaking. "My master spoke then. Charon, do not rage. Thus is it willed, where everything may be simply if it is willed." Notice he doesn't say heaven because we don't mention heaven in the underworld, but he says this is willed by God. In other words, it's fated, it's determined. We're back to the inscriptions in the opening of this canto. "Therefore, oblige and ask no more." In other words, notice back to back here, Virgil has told both Dante the pilgrim and Charon to shut up and just do what you're told. Right? That silenced the grizzled jaws of the gray ferrymen of the livid marsh, who had, now we're going to get a description of Charon, red wheels of flame about his eyes. Notice our first mention of fire. "But at his words, the forlorn and naked souls were changing color." Now, we got all these souls, right? You'll remember these from our study of Virgil's Aeneid, Book 6, right? We're changing color, cursing the human race, God and their parents. So notice, the cursing is in Trinities as well. What do they curse? The human race, they curse God, and they curse their parents. Teeth chattering. This won't be the last time. This is a word picture as well, because we think of hell often as hot. But for Dante, hell is usually more cold than it is hot. The times fire gets used, as we've already said in an earlier lecture, the time fire actually gets used in hell is quite few and far between. For the rest of the time, because there's no light, it's dark, we're in the underworld, it's cold. It's really wretched cold, and your teeth are chattering in their skulls. They called curses on the seed. the place, the hour of their own begetting and their birth. Do you remember, we said this about all of our heroes of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, how each one of them said, Achilles said this, Odysseus said this, definitely Aeneas said this, I wish I had never been born. Here we have it coming to its full fruition. Then they say, I wish I had never been born, and they curse their parents. With wails and tears, they gathered on the evil shore that waits for all who don't fear God. And there's Dante's direct statement about, you want to know how you end up in hell? You don't fear God. Well, what exactly does that mean? That's why you have to read the entire Divine Commedia to get a real sense of that. Obviously, we're going to help you as we go, right? There, demon Charon beckons them with his eyes of fire. And by the way, let's pause for a moment at 3a and make a quick observation. Dante loves to turn many of the mythological figures of classical antiquity, classical literature, into these demons of the underworld. Here, notice Charon is the first of many of the demons, right? Pictured as a demon. Beckons them with his eyes of fire. Crowded in a herd. That'll be interesting because Nietzsche will talk about herd mentality. Ayn Rand will talk about the herd. Here, notice, they're all collected in a herd. They obey if he should summon. We're back to obedience. And he strikes at any laggards with his oar. In other words, some are kind of like, I don't know what I'm doing. He whacks on them. And then we get this amazing simile. And it will remind us as well of a simile from Virgil. As leaves in quick succession sail down in autumn until the bough beholds its entire store fall into the earth, so Adam's, first mention of Adam, Adam's evil seed swoop from the bank when each is called, as sure as a trained falcon. Again, another simile. So notice we're stacking them on top of each other. First leaves, now falcons. As a trained falcon to cross to the other side of the dark water, and before one throng can land on the far shore, on this side, new souls crowd. By the way, earlier I was quoting Yeats' Second Coming. The falcon cannot hear the falconers, the opening lines of Second Coming. And so you get a sense that Yeats is definitely borrowing heavily from Canto 3 of Inferno, no question. Notice as well what we are saying here is that these souls they want to go, but they're a little reluctant at the same time. We're going to hear more about this now coming as they crowd to the shore. At line 100, my son, said the gentle master, here are joined the souls of all who die in the wrath of God. From every country, by the way, notice death is no discriminator, right? Doesn't matter what language you speak. From every country, all of them eager to find their way across the water. In other words, now they want to get across. For the goad of divine justice, capitalized by the way for Pensky, divine justice, we're back to the beginning of the canto, spurs them so. Their fear is transmuted to desire. In other words, they start out afraid and it translates into desire. In other words, they want their punishment. Now later when we do our Dostoevsky, we will, Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment, both, we will be playing around with this idea that when we do something bad, we want punishment. We want to get caught. Think about the last time that you cheated on an exam, and something in the back of your mind wanted you to get caught and wanted you to get punished. For those of you that are going, yeah, it never happened to me, Dante would say, just wait, finish reading the poem, and then let's see if you can comprehend the concept at all. Here, in other words, we want something. We long for something. What is it that all humans long for? Justice. That's what he's going to argue. Justice, retribution, proper punishment for the things poorly that we've done. That's his view. Now, whether you agree with it or not, that's a 3B question, right? Souls who are good never pass this way. Therefore, if you hear Charon complaining at your presence, consider what that means. This is a compliment, in other words. Notice what Virgil is saying. Charon, if you were a bad soul, Charon would have been willing to put you in the boat. The very fact he doesn't want you in the boat suggests, by Dante the poet, that Dante the pilgrim has a chance. There is, in fact, hope for him. And that hope is, of course, assumed in the journey he's about to take. First through Inferno, then through Purgatory, and finally through Paradise, right? Then, we're told, the earth of that grim shore began to shake. So we got an earthquake. So violently, I shudder and sweat recalling it now. So notice how Dante the poet kind of steps in to remind us that he's working from a script, from a trip that he took before. And he says, even now, after the fact, which tells us Dante made it out of Inferno. See how subtle that is? Even now, after the fact, as I'm writing about this, I shudder and I sweat to remember what that earthquake was like. A wind burst up. We're going to see a lot of winds in the underworld. A wind burst up from the tear-soaked ground to erupt red light and batter my senses. So I fell as though seized by sleep. He swoons or he faints. Now, this swooning or fainting, again, we're going to see in Canto 5. We're going to see it a number of times. And the obvious question is, what's up with the swooning? Well, one answer is Dante the Pilgrim has too much pity for the people in Inferno. As the reader who kind of comes to Inferno for the very first time often has too much pity. We will have a tendency early in this poem to go, oh man, that's just really sad. I mean, a person could make up their mind about something and so they get stung by wasps for eternity and their blood drips down off their face and the maggots eat their blood. I mean, that's just gross. That's really sad. By the end of Inferno, Dante the Pilgrim, and possibly we as readers, certainly Dante the poet would want us as readers to be less sympathetic because we understand divine justice. The other thing I would say is, did you notice that senses here, my senses, were referenced? Go back to our study of Plato's Republic, and you remember that when we were talking Book 6 and Book 7 of the Republic, and that whole allegory or analogy, the cave allegory and the shadows on the wall. Remember what Dante had to say about the senses. They are an uncertain guide, remember he said, for the things that matter most. In our two-box theory, as we've often put it on our whiteboard, that first box ever related to the five senses, a beautiful body. That second box, the concepts, not that which is physical, but metaphysical, beauty itself, right? That notion that the senses will lead one to inappropriate responses. And of course, that's going to make a whole lot of sense when we get to the next few circles of hell, where we're going to have the senses took over and individuals did things. Why? Because it felt good. It felt right, if you will. There was no self-control, we might say. All right, well, let's work now quickly to level 2 and 3. At 2A, well, one of the obvious messages here is we must make a choice. We don't have a choice. Not to choose is in fact a choice, and in Dante's world, not to choose will lead you to, the outside of hell. You don't even get into hell, because not to make a choice is, it's almost like it's worse than making a choice, to not make a choice, because of course, it's to choose not to choose, and in the process of doing that, well, you choose to let whatever happen, and that in and of itself, unacceptable. Of course, another major message is here, and this again goes back to that St. Thomas Aquinas' view of retribution. You get what you deserve. We all get what we deserve, in other words, according to Dante. Another major message early on, notice Dante the Pilgrim. We have a little bit too much compassion and pity that's being felt for individuals who probably deserve something a little bit less. At least that's going to be Dante's view. Again, we'll debate this as we get into it. At level 2B, the symbolism, well, obviously the gates of hell represent, and the words over the gates of hell represent or symbolize eternal justice. The irony of course, the uncommitted is that they're doomed for being uncommitted, and of course they're stung into action now because earlier they couldn't make themselves do anything. For our view of Dante as poet, well, obviously using Charon, like Virgil, and all the other mythological characters that he's going to use. Dante as politician. At line 50, of course, we've got this story about how Benedetto, the friend of Celestine V, becomes Boniface VIII by convincing him to abdicate his responsibility and to just walk away from it all. Dante as philosopher, well, we've mentioned already Aquinas and this contrapassio idea, the law of retribution. You get what you deserve. You get what you choose, actually. In other words, you choose pain, you get pain. I guess an easy way to say this is, before one of your pals is ready to make a really stupid choice, you might use that phrase, all right, walk into that propeller and see how it feels. That's exactly what Aquinas and Dante are arguing for. At 3A, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid obviously play this game of are the gods to blame? That's the Theodicy question. It culminates, of course, with Milton's Paradise Lost. But certainly we'll play the game here. And Dante's answer is no, God is not to blame. You choose, that's what happens to you. Of course, we'll also make the observation that this is a question that comes up again and again and again. Maybe in the most famous lines ever written in the English language is, of course, from Hamlet, Act 3, to be or not to be. The conclusion of that soliloquy, conscience makes cowards of us all. We'll get there when we study our Hamlet, and of course we'll come back to these lines here in Dante. what is your favorite text about having to decide about what it is you're going to do? Conrad comes to mind often in this discussion, especially Lord Jim, where a decision has to be made and how you live with yourself after you've made the decision. Finally, at 3b, well, obviously the question here is it fair, is it right to punish eternally? Right? Okay, like for example, the student who said, well, it reminds me the other day I heard a friend of mine, she got in trouble and her parents took away her cell phone for an entire year. Seriously? An entire year? It's kind of the same question. In other words, is it ever fair to punish somebody forever, for eternity? What are your thoughts about that one? Is that in fact justice? Is that love? Right? Is it true that you are your choices? Do you buy that? Do we really get, in the end, do you think, what we deserve? And then what about children? I mean, if a child is born to a poor, destitute heroin addict under a bridge in Detroit, is that child? I mean, did that child deserve that? Obviously, some questions that we'll come back to. By the way, what was a time, you knew this was coming, right? What was a time you couldn't choose? And so you chose to do nothing. By choosing, you chose to do nothing. And that moment, did you think of that as a sin? Was that a sin for you? That like you chose, but you chose to do absolutely nothing? Well, that's Canto 3. We now turn to Canto 4. This will be our true first circle of hell. It's what we call Limbo. Now, Dante has a serious problem that we're going to have to get into. What do you do with all of the quote-unquote good souls that lived before the time Christ was born and Christ was crucified so that you can be baptized and saved? What do you do with all those people? Like, for example, what do you do with Virgil? What do you do with Homer? What do you do, for example, with somebody like Aristotle, the great philosopher? Where do you put them? The answer will be limbo. Come back and we'll have some conversation about limbo. Thank you.